So we're up to putting floats into our carburetors. Now, typically I like to replace the floats because they are a weak point. I use the Weber plastic ones, which are the newer style that have come out. I actually find less issues with these. They're a stronger float than the brass and copper ones, and they tend to be a little bit better in the production quality. So each float is supposed to weigh approximately 25.5 grams. So we have a factory one here. I'm not sure if we can read that on this one, but they'll actually be marked with 25.5 grams. Now, the weight of the float will influence how much fuel is available in the fuel bowl. To weigh a float, to check it, we're just going to place it on our scale. This one weighs in at 25.7. Next one, 25.5, so that one's actually matches, and 25.5. So these are actually pretty good. Now, if you had just pulled these out and they had a leak in them and there was fuel in them, they would weigh heavier, obviously, and you can also shake them and feel the difference. Plastic ones typically come in a little bit lighter. They're at 25.1, 25, 25.1. So I just grabbed the first three right here. Now that is going to make a very slight difference in the amount of fuel that is available in the bowl. It is going to float up a little bit faster and shut the fuel off, but within a half a gram I think I'm quite happy to use them, and as I said, I found them to be more reliable than the brass floats. So to install a float, I've put a new copper seal ring on my axle, and the float is installed this way. A lot of the times I will find them upside down where people think they go this direction, which makes them work not very well. We're just going to take this down, take our axle and slide it through, and then we're going to screw it down till it's finger tight, and we'll let the float drop down. Now when the needle valve is assembled into the carburetor, what will happen is this stop will not let the floats drop all the way down. It'll actually hit the body of the needle and seat assembly, and that's the purpose of it. But we're going to have to adjust these two items anyways. So we're going to go through and process our top plates. On these ones you can see that the steel vent tubes that normally sit on top of the carburetor. So the purpose of this tall vent tube is to get the fuel bowl venting to the same height as the air horn. So normally when our air horn sits on here, everything will be at the same height. That way we don't have fuel vapor hanging around this area where it can, if there's a backfire, ignite. When you have the aluminum plates re-anodized back to the gold color, the steel tube needs to be removed. The original steel tubes are pushed through this hole, and then on the bottom they just peen them over, so when you remove them they're no longer usable. What I do is, this hole is a 7mm hole. I will tap that with a M8x1 tap, and then I make a new tube and thread it in with a little bit of Loctite. This actually solves two problems. One, it gets rid of the tube for the anodizing process. These tubes also have a nasty habit of coming loose and vibrating around, so it also solves that issue. But first, before I make some new tubes, I'm going to re-tap all our holes, just the same as we did on the carburetor body. Then I'll tap these holes and we'll make some new tubes. So I've set these up in my mill, only because I want to keep them nice and straight. So I have my 1, 2, 3 blocks underneath them. I'm secured down. I'm not tightened real tight, but I've got a machine surface here and it's nice and flat. We're going to power tap them at low speed. I have an M8x1 tap in there, which is the perfect size for an M7 hole. Then move over and grab the other hole. That's it, we've got our threads cut here. We've already retapped all of these holes, so all I got to do is make my tubes next. I've got my piece of zinc plated pipe and I've already cut it to length, and I've cut it an extra 10 millimeters longer than it needs to be. I'm going to set it in the chuck. I've already got our program, and we're going to cut our M8x1 threads. There's our vent pipe with our thread. All we've got to do is screw that into the carburetor top now. So now I've finished our tubes. I'm just going to install them into the tops. And for this I'm just going to use a little bit of blue Loctite just to seat them in there so they don't come out. And I just got to screw them in finger tight. The Loctite will hold them there. Okay, that's it, and our vent tubes are done. I'm going to go ahead and set my float height. So first thing I want to do is I'm going to bring my float up, then I'm going to use a piece of vacuum hose that I've just trimmed down, and this is going to act as a retainer. And I just want to carefully wedge that in. I don't want to distort anything. The next thing I want to do is that the height from the top of the float to the body without a gasket is going to be 13 millimeters. So I'm using my float tool, which just makes it a lot easier. And what I want to do is just work this down, and the vacuum hose is going to hold the float exactly where it would be if it was full. Next, I'm going to measure across the body and measure down to the float tang. Now this is where the needle and seat is going to be contacted by the float, and this is the height at which the fuel is going to be shut off. We have 17.94 millimeters. I'm going to take my needle and seat, and the needle and seat is going to have a little ball valve on the bottom that moves. I'm going to put a 1 millimeter spacing, which is just my starting spacer. Screw that down, and I want to go ahead and tighten it. So now I'm going to transfer my measurement from my needle and seat to the gasket surface. And this is where you want to be careful. You don't want to compress that ball valve. I like to contact it and then bump it just a little. You got to make sure it's all the way down, so angle it down. So 18 millimeters is 18.09. That's with the ball valve compressed slightly. If I bring it up till it releases, it's about 18 and a half. So if I bring it down, let's say split the difference at 18.25 millimeters. So that means I need to bring this tang up slightly to right around 18.2 to 18.25 millimeters. So if I recheck my measurement, we have 17.9. So that means to bring this dimension up to 18.25, I need to push the float tang down to make that a longer dimension. So I'm just going to hold the float and flex that ever slightly. I want to recheck my adjustment, make sure my float is still in the same place. Yep, we've got clearance. I got contact. And we have 18.4 millimeters, so I'll bump it up just a hair. $18.28, and that's it. That's as simple as that. We're just going to repeat that process through the other 3 needles and seats, And that's all you really need to do to dry set these. And you can check them after with a wet test if you wanted to, but I've never had any problems just setting them up dry and running them. So now we've set the floats on both sides. We've got our top plates ready. I can go ahead and install my auxiliary boosters. Has a hole on one side and a spring on the other. You got to make sure the hole faces the jet package, and these should pretty much just press in and seat down, and you just want to make sure that this is flat across the surface. I have found some that you need to dress, in which case just pull it back out, dress it with a file. Okay. Sometimes that spring's a little tight and you just got to give them a little tap. And I see you're just using the back of my punch here, back of my awl. Okay. Next, our gasket is going to go on. These are usually pretty universal, and doesn't matter if you flip them either way. They have all the same set of holes. You just want to be careful that you ease it down over the studs and don't rip. Then I usually like to have just one last look through, make sure my jets are all in, everything's tight, and then we can go ahead and sit our top plate on. All we have to do now is tighten down the top plate. First I'm going to put my spring purchase on. This is on our longer stud, and these are going to be M5 nuts that are Nylox. These are a one-time use, so once you put them on, that's it. That's why when we did our disassembly, we just threw all those straight in the trash. When I tighten this down, I'm just going to work from the middle out and kind of rotate around. That's it. That's our top plate on. Now we can go ahead and finish wrapping up the rest of this carburetor. Okay, so next I'm going to put in my needle and seat covers. Now these are one of those parts that I rarely reuse just because they get a lot of damage. They've got a real low hex on them, and as you saw in our disassembly, how we got those off was kind of unique. New sealing washer. Screw these down. So when I tighten these now, I want to use a good quality wrench, ideally a 6-point, even though I'm using a 12-point, and I'm going to bring it up till it contacts, and you notice my hand here. I've got to make sure that the carburetor and the wrench stay nice and flat, because if I go like this, it'll peel off very easily, and I want to bring those down and tighten. Now these do not need a lot of torque. We're talking around the 25 Newton meter range, just because it's an aluminum crush washer in there. If you find that they're leaking once you get them back onto the car and you haven't replaced them, most likely this surface is damaged from over tightening. So we're coming down to the last few things we've got to do. Return spring, just hold in the front there. So I'm going to hook it into the arm first. Sometimes you need to give it a little bend or a twist, and then it should pull up and come straight on. When this opens, you want to make sure that this clears, goes all the way to full throttle, and it should have a fairly solid return back to the idle position. So we're going to go ahead and install our air bypass screws. These are usually one of the most misunderstood parts of carburetor adjustment. What we want to do is bring these in and lightly seat, and that doesn't mean you crank down on them super hard. I usually bring them in till they contact once, back them off, bring them in till they contact, and that's it. And then take our lock nut, and we're just going to tighten that down. These screws are used to adjust for individual differences in airflow at idle speed only. I see a lot of guys that will back these off like 2.5 tons and think you screw one in, screw one out. That is actually the worst thing you can do. It will create a lot of tunability issues. You'll create backfiring on deceleration, and it will change the progression port timing. So for now, we want to lightly seat them. We'll check it on the engine once we get it on and get it started and see if any need to be adjusted. Next, we want to do our mixture screws. So we're going to load our mixture screws with the anti-vibration spring. And then I usually like to just lubricate the threads, only because these will be screwed in and out in the car. We're going to put a O-ring cup retainer, and then followed by an O-ring. Now all we want to do here is get these screwed in, and we're just going to do a bench set. And all a bench set is a starting point that should be enough to get the car to start and run, but won't be a final mixture set. The other thing you've got to be careful is you've got to really feel it. The tips on these are quite thin. I have had guys screw them in thinking that they hadn't contacted and screwed them in until they've actually broken the tip. And usually when it breaks, it sticks in the carburetor body, so you can't just pull it out and pull the piece out. So I'll wind them in and I'll feel it contact right there. And then I'm just going to go half, one, half, two. So we've got our final adjustments set up. We've got our air bypass screws in. All we've got to do is some wrap up stuff. I'm going to install my studs for my air horns. And these ones have a machined piece, and this makes it easy to install the nut when it's in the car. It'll drop by that air horn like that. Some of the later model carburetors do not use this style, and they're a little bit harder to get started. So we'll get these installed. So we want to safety wire our choke screws, which are these three in the front, and our our float pivot screws right here in the back. So to do that, I'm using stainless steel safety wire, and I will just go ahead and cut off 5 lengths to get started. Okay. To do this, you will need to use a set of twister pliers. These, as you pull them out, will spin, and you do need to be careful. It's easy to break this, so you don't want to over twist. So the way I do it is I start and I fold the line in half first and just squeeze it up nice and tight. Usually what I want to do is just like 1 or 2 twists right there, just like that. Then I'm going to use a small set of needle nose. And this is where you want to be careful that you don't over tighten, because it's easy to snap this. So I'm just going to get it started. Okay, so it should look like that. I'm going to cut the tail off, making sure I leave plenty sticking out so it retains its strength, and then push that up. Now these are really, really sharp, so you got to be careful with your fingers. On the front, we're going to use the same kind of method. We're going to come through the hole in the body, kind of bend it and squeeze it in the middle. Give it like 2 or 3 rotations, and that just kind of makes it look nice and neat. And just square it up so it looks good. And the same thing, you got to be careful not to over tighten because you can easily snap. That's it. I'm going to continue on, do the rest on this one, then we'll do the next carburetor. Okay, so I'm going to do the fuel line next. I've already replaced the fuel hose between my banjos. These are just ferrules that stop it expanding. We're only looking at 2.5 psi of pressure in here, so you don't actually need a clamp. And you could actually just use a straight piece of hose if you like as well. So to load these, we're going to use our fiber washers. So we're going to drop the smaller OD washer on first, followed by our filters. Then drop our fuel rail in, and then our large washer, which has the larger outside diameter to seal on the outside, goes on next. You want to make sure this nozzle is facing the rear. Now, when you go to tighten these, there is a little bit of movement. I generally try and kind of make sure my washer looks lined up here. If it's not, loosen it up and push it up with your fingernail, just so it's nicely outlined around the gasket area. Okay, that's it. This one's done. This one's ready to go onto the engine. Normally I'll put it onto the engine before I put my top air filter hat and air horns on and do all of our tune-up work, just in case I need to get back into a needle and seat or something needs to be adjusted that we missed or we had a problem with. So next step for these is onto the test engine.